They followed Charlie into the dining room where the table had been laid for tea. I thought you'd enjoy a wartime meal to help you get the feel of life during the war. You can dress up in some of the old children's clothes if you like. Mrs. Graham always kept some ready for evacuees. Sometimes they would turn up in nothing but what they stood up in. The clothes were in the wardrobe in the back bedroom. Thanks, Charlie, said Lizzie, nudging Katy, who seemed to be in a daze. I'm starving. Come on, sleepyhead, let's get dressed up like Charlie said, giggled Lizzie, racing upstairs. Katy followed behind slowly, mulling things over before deciding not to say anything in front of Patrick. It sounded too weird to explain, and she didn't trust him yet. In the bedroom, Lizzie flung open the wardrobe and began to rummage through the clothes. Here, put on these shorts and this shirt and this tank top, she said to Patrick, handing a pile of clothes to him. You'll need these long grey socks, and look, there's even a cap to put on. Okay, said Patrick, but you'd better get dressed up too. I'm not going to be the only one looking stupid. Don't worry, I found a couple of check dresses here with cardigans and some long white socks for us to wear. Katy groaned. Do we have to? Yes, said Lizzie with authority. I want to win the prize for this project. Reluctantly, Katy got change and even agreed to let Lizzie put her hair into 2 bunches. Don't forget this, instructed Lizzie, throwing a hand-knitted woolen cardigan across the room to Katy where it landed at her feet. Katy bent over to pick it up and noticed something dangling out of the pocket. Look at this, she said, showing Lizzie a delicate silver watch on a well-worn, soft black leather strap. I wonder how long it's been in the pocket and who it belonged to. Lizzie reached out and took it from her for a closer look. Katy watched Lizzie's expression change from one of mild interest to wide surprise as she handed the watch back. Check out the date and time. The watch stopped. Katy looked at the watch face and saw the date, the 15th of May, 1942. The tiny hands had stopped dead on 6 o'clock too. Lizzie and Katy stared at each other in surprise, too stunned to speak. Oh, stop being stupid, you two, said Patrick. Old watches like this need winding every day or they stop. We know the family moved out after the bombing. That's why the watch has stopped on that date. No one's worn it since. Give it here, he instructed. Katy handed it over to Patrick, who quickly wound it up and adjusted it until it said the correct date and time. Here you go, put it on now. Katy reluctantly fastened the watch on her wrist and momentarily stopped dead in her tracks as the dream flashed in front of her eyes again. For a split second she almost caught a glimpse of her companion cycling behind her. Just as their face began to come into view, she felt a hand shaking her shoulder and the image vanished. Katy, what's the matter with you today? You keep zoning out, huffed Lizzie. Nothing, I'm just tired, that's all, insisted Katy. Turning to look in the mirror, she laughed. Oh, we look ridiculous. Lizzie stood staring at Patrick and Katy. It's strange, but you two seem to suit those clothes. I reckon you fit right in. Cheeky, said Katy. Are you saying we're old-fashioned? I know, said Patrick. I'll film you and then you can show your mum what you look like as someone from the 1940s. After 10 minutes, Katy had had enough. Come on, I'm starving. Let's go and eat. Patrick picked up a note from the table and read it aloud. This is the sort of tea we could only have on special occasions during the war, as so many foods were rationed. The Grahams, however, usually ate better than most, as they had their own hens and a goat, as well as a small vegetable plot of their own. You were usually sure of a good tea at their table. It was a standing joke that I always knocked on the door as the table was being laid for supper. Enjoy, Charlie. On the table lay a loaf of freshly baked, crusty bread. It smelt delicious, along with plenty of butter and a jar of Charlie's homemade strawberry jam. There were also hard-boiled eggs, slices of ham, and big chunks of cheddar cheese and an enormous jug of homemade lemonade. They were all chatting happily when Lizzie glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. Oh no, I'm going to be late. I promised Mum I'd be home by 4:30 to work the dog. She raced upstairs and quickly changed into her own clothes and called out bye. Well, what shall we do now, said Patrick. We don't need to be home for another hour. Well, let's stay until 5 o'clock when Charlie will be back. I want to have a look through those old magazines and photo albums. We might find something to use in the project. Oh, but it's a bit quiet, said Patrick, walking over to the radiogram. Let's see if we can tune this old thing into the 21st century. After a few minutes messing about with the dials, they successfully found their favourite music station. Katy lay on the carpet, happily flicking through old magazines, and Patrick lay on the couch with a pile of old comics. They both must have fallen asleep, as it was some time later that Katy jolted awake, unsure of where she was. Patrick lay snoring on the couch. Katy leant over and shook him by the shoulder. Wake up, Patrick. What's happened? Why hasn't Charlie come back for us? He stretched and sat up, looking equally confused. That was strange, falling asleep. It must have been all the food. Come on, let's get changed and get going. They sat side by side for a few moments, trying to summon the energy to get moving. Suddenly Patrick noticed something strange. Listen. What's happened to the radio? Why? What's the matter? Just listen, said Patrick. The voice speaking on the radio sounded odd. It was clipped and precise, old-fashioned even, like someone from one of the old black and white films Katy liked to watch. They listened as Big Ben chimed and the radio presenter announced the 6 o'clock news. Katy and Patrick stared at each other in disbelief as they listened to the headlines. This is the 6 o'clock news read by Ralph Robinson, reporting live from the BBC on Sunday the 12th of April 1942. The voice went on to report bombings in London and Liverpool. Katy glanced nervously down at the watch on her wrist. Her eyes widened in shock. This couldn't be happening. The watch must be wrong. She quickly tried to hide both her panic and the watch from Patrick, but she wasn't fast enough. Show me, he demanded. Reluctantly, Katy turned the watch face towards him. Patrick's mouth fell wide open and he looked at Katy. His face had gone pale and his voice began to shake as he spoke. But that's impossible. I just set it. You saw me to today's date. Why does it say the 12th of April 1942? That's the same date the radio announcer just said. What's happening, Katy? Oh, I don't know. It must be some sort of joke programme. You know, like an April Fool, Katy replied, squeezing his hand in an attempt to reassure him. Feeling agitated, she jumped up and walked over to the window to see if she could spot Charlie making his way back to tidy up. The scene outside looked much the same, yet Katy had a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. What could it be? Her fears were soon confirmed by Patrick, who joined her at the window. Look at the cars. Katy, people don't drive cars like that anymore. Cars like that are kept in museums. Katy looked down the street at the cars. They do look strange. What's going on? Maybe it's, an old car rally. But the gardens are different too, replied Patrick, sounding increasingly panicked. Most of them have been paved over for parking cars on. But look now. They look like vegetable gardens. You're right, but there must be some reasonable... began Katy nervously, but Patrick cut her off. And the street lamps. Look at the street lamps. They're all wrong too. They look like gas lights, Katy. Patrick began to tremble with fear and reached out, gripping Katy's arm tightly. A sinking feeling began to build in the pit of Katy's churning stomach as she took a moment to consider Patrick's observations. It was only then that she caught sight of the calendar on the wall. The page had previously said May the 15th, 1942. Now it read April the 12th, 1942. This date was also circled boldly in red. Katy stepped towards it in order to read the writing scrawled underneath. Evacuees Katy and Patrick Parker arrive at the station at 6 o'clock. Pick up. Katy opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stared at her brother, frozen to the spot. What on earth had happened whilst they were asleep? Okay, that's the end of chapter 3.